The cold did not announce itself with noise. It arrived in silence. In the frozen hills of Korea, temperatures dropped so low that metal cracked, and breath turned to ice before it faded. Rifles jammed. Radios failed. Even experienced soldiers struggled against a winter that seemed determined to defeat them before any enemy could. But among the United Nations forces, one group moved differently. Calm, prepared, layered in knowledge earned from generations of harsh winters. And soon, even elite U.S. Marines began watching them closely. Because survival in Korea wasn't just about strength. It was about understanding the cold. Keep watching to discover how Canadians helped turn winter into an advantage. Like the video. Subscribe to the channel. The winter of 1950 in Korea was not simply weather. It was a force. Temperatures plunged far below freezing. Winds swept through valleys with sharp intensity. Snow hardened into ice. Movement became slower. Fingers numbed inside gloves. Engines refused to start. For many American units, the Korean terrain felt unfamiliar and unforgiving. Most had trained for combat, not extreme Arctic-like conditions. Their equipment was strong, their courage unquestioned. But winter warfare required more than determination. Canadian soldiers, however, came from a country shaped by snow and ice. Many had grown up facing winters that demanded preparation and patience. Cold weather drills were not new to them. Layered clothing systems, careful movement to prevent sweating, maintaining dry socks, protecting weapon mechanisms from freezing. These were habits, not emergency adjustments. When joint operations brought Canadian and American forces together, subtle differences began to stand out. While some units struggled with frostbite and frozen gear, Canadian soldiers demonstrated small but critical techniques. They insulated trenches differently. They rotated sentries more frequently to prevent exposure fatigue. They adjusted sleep schedules to conserve warmth. They taught the importance of ventilation inside tents to prevent ice buildup. These details seemed minor at first, but in sub-zero conditions, minor details determined survival. One Marine officer later observed that the Canadians treated winter not as an obstacle, but as terrain, something to be studied, understood, managed. Instead of fighting the cold, they worked with it. They showed how to position vehicles facing downhill so frozen brakes would not lock, how to warm rations without wasting fuel, how to keep ammunition dry inside layered wrapping. Practical knowledge, quiet leadership, and gradually respect replaced surprise. This was not about one force being superior to another. It was about experience meeting necessity. Winter does not reward pride. It rewards preparation. American units began adapting quickly. Training adjustments were made. Equipment usage shifted. Shared patrol strategies improved coordination between forces. What began as observation turned into collaboration. The frozen landscape that once seemed overwhelming became more manageable. Not easier, but survivable. Canadian troops never claimed credit. They simply did what they had always done at home. Respect the cold, and prepare for it. In doing so, they strengthened the entire coalition effort. Because sometimes the most important lessons in war are not about tactics or firepower. Sometimes they are about endurance. And in the mountains of Korea, endurance meant everything. The cold did not ease. It deepened. As winter tightened its grip across the Korean peninsula, supply lines stretched thin. Snow covered roads that had once been clear. Ice formed under truck tires. Bridges became slick and unpredictable. Movement slowed. Not because soldiers lacked will, but because the environment demanded caution. For many American units, the first shock had already passed. They had learned quickly, but now came the second test. Sustainability. Surviving one frozen night was different from surviving weeks of relentless cold. Canadian forces understood this distinction well. They emphasized routine, discipline in the smallest actions. Boots were checked twice daily. Socks were changed even when soldiers insisted they felt fine. Weapons were inspected more often than regulations required. Because frostbite does not begin with pain. It begins with numbness. Canadian NCOs, non-commissioned officers, moved through positions quietly, inspecting faces, ears, hands. They looked for pale skin, stiff movements, the early warning signs others might ignore. They also stressed something else: controlled effort. In extreme cold, sweating could be dangerous. Moisture trapped inside clothing would freeze once movement stopped. Canadian troops were trained to regulate pace, remove a layer before climbing, replace it before resting. These adjustments were not dramatic. They were disciplined. U.S. Marine units began incorporating similar practices into their rotations. Shared patrols allowed direct exchange of experience. Canadian soldiers demonstrated how to build snow walls to block wind without trapping smoke. They showed how to dig fighting positions that drained meltwater properly when temperatures briefly rose. Even morale required adaptation. Winter fatigue is quiet. It builds slowly. The silence of snow absorbs sound. Long nights stretch longer. Canadian officers encourage small routines. Hot drinks at scheduled intervals, brief group check-ins, clear communication of daily objectives. Structure combats isolation. American commanders took notice. What initially appeared to be simple, cold weather familiarity revealed itself as a system, a culture of preparation rooted in geography and habit. And it was working. Where frostbite cases had once increased rapidly, they began to decline. Equipment failures dropped as maintenance routines improved. Units that had struggled to stay operational regained consistency. The collaboration became mutual. American logistics strength combined with Canadian winter knowledge. Improved supply coordination meant better distribution of cold weather gear. Shared intelligence helped predict weather shifts more accurately. The battlefield had not changed, but the response to it had. One Marine platoon leader later reflected that what impressed him most was not a single dramatic moment. It was the calm. Canadians did not panic when temperatures fell further. They adjusted. They expected hardship. And expectation changes mindset. Joint operations in mountainous sectors required night patrols through snow-covered ridges. Visibility was limited. Sound carried unpredictably. Canadian scouts demonstrated how to move in staggered formations to reduce snow noise, how to use terrain contours to shield against wind chill. Small refinements, major impact. Trust grew in those frozen hills. It was not announced in speeches. It was built through shared watches in the dark, through exchanged gloves when someone's pair tore, through shared rations heated over small, carefully shielded stoves. Winter remained dangerous, but it was no longer mysterious, and that distinction mattered, because once an environment is understood, it becomes manageable. The Korean winter tested endurance, equipment, and morale. Yet within that test, cooperation transformed vulnerability into strength. Canadian experience did not replace American resilience. It complemented it. Together they adapted. And in war, adaptation is survival. The cold was no longer the only enemy. Now it was a condition to be mastered. By the heart of winter, joint Canadian and American positions had changed in subtle but powerful ways. Trenches were deeper. Snow barriers were angled against the wind. Supply caches were buried, strategically beneath insulated coverings to prevent freezing damage. What had once felt improvised now felt deliberate. And that shift in mindset began influencing operations beyond simple survival. Patrol routes were adjusted based on wind direction. Units learned to move along ridgelines during certain hours when visibility favored them. Night watch rotations were refined to prevent exhaustion. Cold weather was no longer disrupting strategy. It was shaping it. Canadian officers often emphasized reconnaissance in winter conditions. Snow preserved footprints. Disturbances in ice revealed recent movement. Patterns became visible that might have gone unnoticed in warmer months. Winter was not just harsh. It was revealing. American Marines quickly saw the advantage. Tracks in snow told stories of patrol size, direction, hesitation. Frozen ground reduced noise if approached carefully. Clear air improved long-distance visibility. The same environment that once slowed them could now assist them. Joint briefings became more detailed. Canadian veterans shared lessons from previous cold weather training exercises. Marines contributed insights from amphibious and rapid deployment experience. Knowledge moved both ways. One of the most critical adjustments involved equipment maintenance. Metal contracts in extreme cold. Lubricants thicken. Batteries drain faster. Canadian soldiers demonstrated minimal lubrication techniques to prevent rifle malfunctions. They showed how to keep radios insulated overnight to preserve charge. These were not heroic gestures. They were habits built over decades of living with winter. And those habits began saving operational time. Fewer breakdowns meant smoother coordination. Fewer medical evacuations for exposure meant stronger front lines. Morale also shifted. Instead of dreading nightfall, soldiers prepared for it. Instead of reacting to temperature drops, they anticipated them. Preparation replaced anxiety. Stories began circulating quietly among units, not of dramatic rescues, but of shared resilience. A Marine recalling how a Canadian corporal corrected his layering before a patrol. A Canadian scout thanking an American logistics team for securing additional thermal supplies. Respect deepened. Leadership at higher levels noticed the improvement. Reports highlighted reduced cold weather casualties. Operational effectiveness during winter months increased. The winter had not softened. The soldiers had strengthened. There is something powerful about collective adaptation. When two forces learn from each other without ego, efficiency follows. Canadians did not present themselves as instructors. Americans did not resist guidance. They recognized necessity. In one particularly harsh stretch, temperatures dropped even further. Wind gusts swept through exposed positions. Yet joint patrols continued, steady, measured, confident. The cold still bit at exposed skin. Breath still formed clouds in the night air. But now, gloves were layered correctly. Faces were protected. Movements were calculated. The difference between chaos and control is often preparation. And by late winter, preparation had become instinct. The mountains of Korea remained unforgiving. Yet the coalition forces standing upon them were no longer caught off guard. They had learned, together. Winter had once threatened to weaken their resolve. Instead, it strengthened their cooperation. And in that cooperation, something greater than individual survival emerged. It was unity shaped by shared hardship. By the time winter began to loosen its grip, something fundamental had changed. The snow still covered the hills. The wind still cut through exposed ridgelines. But the fear of the cold, the uncertainty that had once unsettled entire units, was gone. In its place stood confidence. Canadian and American troops had not defeated winter. That was never possible. But they had learned to operate within it without hesitation. And that confidence carried into everything else. Operations planned for late winter and early spring, no longer treated weather as an unpredictable disruption. It became a variable to calculate. Commanders considered wind chill alongside terrain. They timed movements based on daylight reflection from snow. They scheduled supply drops with cold preservation in mind. Preparation was no longer reactive. It was integrated. The lessons extended beyond tactics. For many American Marines, the experience reshaped their understanding of coalition warfare. Strength was not only about firepower or numbers. It was also about experience shaped by geography and culture. Canadian forces had grown up in harsh winters. That background, something that once seemed unrelated to distant battlefields, became a strategic advantage, and that advantage was shared. As winter patrols turned into early thaw operations, joint units moved with cohesion that had not existed months earlier. Communication flowed naturally. Small adjustments were understood without lengthy explanation. Trust had been built in silence, under snowfall, during long night watches. There were no grand announcements, no official declarations that winter had been conquered. But casualty reports told part of the story. Exposure-related injuries had decreased significantly. Equipment reliability had improved. Operational readiness had stabilized during conditions that once threatened disruption. The difference was measurable. More importantly, it was human. Soldiers who had once struggled through freezing nights now shared techniques instinctively. New arrivals were briefed thoroughly before stepping into forward positions. Cold weather discipline became part of unit identity. The Korean winter had forced adaptation, and adaptation created resilience. Looking back, historians often focus on major offensives, decisive maneuvers, and dramatic turning points. Yet sometimes the quiet transformations matter just as much. A shift in routine, a shared lesson, a small correction that prevents a larger failure. In the frozen mountains, Canadians did not seek recognition. They applied what they knew. American Marines did not resist learning. They applied what worked. Together, they demonstrated something powerful. Cooperation under pressure multiplies strength. Winter had once threatened to divide units by hardship. Instead, it united them through shared discipline. When spring finally arrived, the landscape changed. Snow melted. Mud replaced ice. Patrol routes shifted again, but the habits forged in winter remained. Layer before movement. Check your comrades' gloves. Inspect your equipment twice. Never underestimate the environment. These principles traveled beyond Korea. They influenced training manuals, cold weather doctrine, and future coalition planning. The story of that winter is not one of rivalry or humiliation. It is one of learning, of humility, of mutual respect between allied forces facing conditions neither could ignore. In war, survival often depends on adaptation, and in Korea's harsh winter, adaptation became shared wisdom. The snow eventually disappeared, but the lessons endured.